How many Reformed Baptist churches do you think are in existence today? I know it's just an estimate. How many do you think? Okay, let's define it as this. That's a good question. These are confessional churches. We'll include not just the confessional churches, but the Calvinistic churches and Baptistic churches that would describe themselves as Reformed Baptists, even if they're not to the same degree or have the same elements that we do.
America or worldwide?
Worldwide. Sorry, let's do America. We'll show it because we at least know a little bit more about America. We'll just do America. Any guesses? In the hundreds or in the thousands? Hundreds, okay. In America? Low thousands, as in like...
Price is Right rules?
No, not Price is Right rules. So when you say low thousands, you mean like less than 10,000s, or what do you mean?
Yes,
Okay, all right. So in 2016, when I first did this lesson, I estimated 300 to 500 Reformed Baptist churches. But I actually did some more research this week, and I think the number is actually quite a bit higher than that, although not exponentially higher than that. I found 3 different websites that didn't exist in 2016, that now exist, that have like directories and maps. And one guesstimate is that there's about 1,200 Reformed Baptist churches in America today, which is more than I would have expected, especially 7 years ago when I first did this lesson, but it's still less than what there used to be. So for instance, at the end of 1700, the 1700s, there were about, beginning of the 1700s, there were about 1,000 Reformed Baptist churches. But by the end of the 1700s and by the 1800s, there was some 70,000 Reformed Baptist churches. That's just in America, So in other words, in the 100 years, from say the 1750s to the 1850s, there was a huge boom, and there was about 700,000 Reformed Baptist churches in America. Can you imagine? What? 700,000. 700,000. And the reason is this, which that blows your mind, and that's why. The reasons we're going to look at is this. So the Baptists grew, but then declined as well. So they grew a lot in the 1700s. By the 1800s, they started to diminish. And we're going to look at some of those questions and answers today. This is actually the question that I get a lot or most about Reformed Baptist theology and churches. People who have never heard of a Reformed Baptist church, like, what is that? I try to explain it, and they'll be like, so why aren't there very many around? And I have to say, well, there used to be a lot, but there aren't as many anymore, and people just don't get it. So if there's a lesson that you can put in your brain or write down on a piece of paper as to why Reformed Baptists are not as common as they used to be, this is the lesson for you to hear and listen to, because this is one I get asked a lot. So here are some of the reasons. Why is there a decline among the Reformed Baptist churches in our country in the modern era, or since the 1800s, I should say? Number one, depraved hearts. That's no surprise. We have sinful, depraved hearts. Indwelling sin remains in all of us. Some generations are more godly, some are less godly, some have more holiness and blessing from God, some have less. Of course, there's the depravity that results in splitting and contention, maybe even personality conflicts. That's one reason. Any other guesses as to what reasons you might think Reformed Baptists in America have declined?
The liberal movement within the Baptists?
Okay. Yeah, let's see if we get to that today. We actually won't get to that today, but that's a good reason why a later decline occurred. Any other guesses? Why they're so uncommon nowadays compared to how common they used to be. What is our country, Mike?
You have a lot more different denominations.
Okay, just the diluting of the different denominations. Okay, we're going to get into that in just a moment. Yep. Think about this one. America loves its liberty, its democracy. We have been conditioned since our founding, leaving Britain and coming here, to have this I do what I want type of mentality. So the Reformed Baptists had their polity that thrived. People love the independent polity. That's why churches that you see in our country tend to be not Episcopal or more the hierarchical groups, but the groups that tend to have a more independent polity. However, when it comes to the Calvinistic theology, our country tended to not be as big of a fan of that. There was something this is a quote from Waldron, which I'll show you. I thought I brought it up with me, maybe I didn't. Here it is. There's something about the political philosophy associated with the Revolution that was profoundly antithetical to Calvinism. So, for instance, some of the founders of the Revolution were not Christians at all. Some, like Jefferson, which we looked at last time, and Benjamin Franklin, they were deists, which is not the same thing as what we believe. And then, after the Revolution, there started to be a period of decline in American churches. So in small scale, think of it like 9/11, September 11th, 2001. Do you remember this, those of you who are old enough, that there was this huge, whoa, everybody's coming back to God, everybody's thinking about God for the first time. Do you guys remember that? Well, you guys might not be old enough, but some of the rest of us are. But what happened right after that, within the years that followed that uptick in church attendance and stuff? Just a slow trickle away. There's something about the revolution and it starting, and then it grows, and yeah, let's all do a new thing and start new churches, and then it declines in the 1800s. For instance, people started to doubt tulip. Okay, every Calvinist needs to know this, even if you don't think about it all the time. You have to at least know it's off the top of your head because people ask these questions. If you're a Calvinist, they assume you know what tulip means, so you at least got to know it for their sake. Okay, so let's go through our tulip doctrine. What's the T in tulip? Total depravity. Okay, let's pause on that for a second. Why wouldn't the independence of America, independence as in the people who were being independent of America, like the idea of total depravity? Okay, we're our own people. We can shape our own destiny. We don't need to be enslaved to anybody else. Okay, U, T-U, what's the U of tulip? Unconditional election. People didn't like that the U in unconditional seems to imply that people were incapable of determining their own course for their own lives. I can forge my own destiny. I don't need to follow God's plan for things. L. What's L? Limited atonement, better called definite atonement or particular redemption, something along those lines. The L they didn't like because the election part thought, well, we forged our own future with this country. We started it ourselves. We chose these things ourselves. I can choose God. I don't have to wait for Him to choose me. God is not the almighty power. I am. I. What's the I of tulip? Irresistible grace. It seemed as if to those at that time that God was made a tyrant of uncontrollable power. Sounds like someone they had just removed from their own influence in the decades prior. Who was? The king. They left the king. They left Great Britain. We don't want autocratic rule over us. We are our own power. Now for the P. What's the P in TULIP? Perseverance to the saints. It seems to, according to Waldron, who's quoting another author, the focus on the volitional commitment of the primary obligation in Perseverance to the saints. That Christians are sustained by the choice of another and preserved in grace to the end of their days. It rendered this whole idea irrelevant. I don't care about somebody else preserving me, persevering me. I don't care about that. It even seemed contradictory. Well, I'm my own man. I can do what I want. So in a sense, Calvinists underwent a crisis of their own conscience, and then even like a deconversion from Calvinism, if you want to call it that, to use modern day terms. So it was this undercurrent of ungodly and anti-Christian spirit in that age. There was an unholy emphasis, and arguably today as well, on inalienable rights, human freedom, and the hatred of authority that emerged as a reaction against Calvinism. So that's the second one. There's a total depraved hearts, I should say. The democratic mentality. Any other guesses as to why Reformed Baptists declined in the 1800s? You got one?
Something about the lack of the use of confessions or seeing the value of confessions.
Yeah, I think that's fair. We'll get to that one in a minute. Next, let's look at revivalism. What is revival? Not revivalism, but just revival. What is revival? What's revival? Like a campaign that you hold at your church where the speaker comes and everybody gets saved again? What is revival?
When the Spirit of God moves powerfully and converts many people all at one time.
Yeah, it doesn't have to be all at one moment, but over a short period of time, there seems to be a movement toward spiritual change. Here's how Ian Murray defines it in his book, Revival and Revivalism. Revival is God using ordinary means to effect extraordinary change, whereas revivalism, this idea of manipulating it, is when a person tries to use extraordinary means to effect the same extraordinary change. So let's say one Sunday, I'm up here and I quote John 3:16. And immediately, one of our young people in our midst is converted. Amazing, powerful. So then Wes comes to me next Sunday and says, hey, last Sunday you recited John 3:16. Recite it again this Sunday and see if somebody else is converted. Okay, it's worth a shot. So I recited it again. Sure enough, somebody else comes to faith. So not every Sunday we have to do the same exact thing to try to manipulate the circumstances to get somebody to come into faith. It's not a good thing to try to use extraordinary means to affect the same extraordinary change. And I looked at last week the idea of Charles Finney, who had the anxious bench, and he would have these invitations to come down and make them long and so long that you were basically worn out. So the Great Awakening, like I looked at last week, was genuinely a work of God, it seems, but the ones that follow were probably less likely. That's because the first Great Awakening's revival seemed to be that of both the heart and the head. For instance, Jonathan Edwards preached very biblical sermons. But the second quote-unquote Great Awakening had some Calvinistic components to it, but it was significantly less, and it was because of this heart, emotions only mentality. There was true revival even in the 1800s. There's a guy named Asahel Nettleton, and he was used of God to bring about a true revival, which we praise God for. But the second Great Awakening had components that were not Calvinistic and not confessional either. There were country churches, for instance, that didn't have any Calvinistic emphasis. So to Alex's point, the churches that were really gung-ho about revivalism and making this happen were less confessional churches, less grounded in theology and less focused on what goes along with your head, but instead just all about your feelings and your heart. So as a result, those who were suspicious of true revival in the Second Great Awakening become other people, though those who were pro-revivalism, started to become suspicious of those Calvinistic churches like our own, if we had existed 200 years ago, because we were not a fan of the revival. That sounded really confusing as it just came out of my mouth. Did that make any sense? No, it didn't make any sense. Okay, let's choose a person here. Mike, let's choose Mike since he nodded his head. Mike is pro-revivalism. He says, let's bring everybody down, use extraordinary means to effect extraordinary change. Alex over here, no surprise, is a Calvinist, and he's a confessional guy, and he's like, maybe, we'll see. So then Mike and his cronies start to become suspicious of Alex and his church buddies and their churches because they're not supportive of the movement that you like. Does that make any more sense, Mike? Okay, so that's what's going on in this particular area. So because of this opposition, the churches started to diminish because they were seen as anti-fun. They were like, hey, we're having this great movement, jump aboard. And the Calvinists were like, not so much. But revivalism in the end became a mighty engine of doctrinal destruction because what it did is it diluted the actual gospel truth in favor of emotionalism and revivalism. It was because of this anti-confessional attitude that over the next 150 years, a massive defection from Calvinism would occur, and it would be a first loss to Arminianism, which is akin to revivalism, and then to modernism, which we call liberalism in the next century. Now, just to clarify, I'm not opposed, and nobody's opposed in our circles, to genuine revival. But it's revivalism that just says that it's a matter of feeling, we can manipulate things to make it happen. That's what we're opposed to. For instance, have any of you heard of the quote-unquote revival going on right now at Asbury College and Seminary? You guys heard about that? I don't know a lot of details, but supposedly there's a revival going on. I found an article this past week about it, and I went to look up the article this morning to read it to you, but they either had taken it down or their website got overloaded because I could no longer access it. But when you read the article, and it was from their campus newspaper interviewing people about the revival, it was all about feeling. Oh, I just felt the presence of God upon me. My burden was lifted. Now, is that true? Of course. But it seems as if they were more based upon what they could feel and all the cool people around them also feeling the same thing than they were about the actual truth. The sermon, for instance, from that day from chapel that supposedly sparked this revival was a sermon on healing. Well, who doesn't want to be healed? Who doesn't want to have enough faith to be healed? So I don't know whether that's true revival. I'm a little hesitant, but we'll see. It could be. That would be wonderful if it was. But that could be an instance of revivalism. Next, there was that of Methodism. There was fighting going on among the Methodists and the Baptists, these two most active groups on the new frontier of America. They were basically battling for the same converts and churchgoers. Here's a hilarious story I want to read to you from Baptist Roots in America. Sam Waldron. Peter Cartwright was a Methodist circuit rider, which by the way just means he went from place to place preaching the gospel. He stopped to preach in a crumbling old Baptist church. When he preached, there were a number of people converted. But then, of course, because he's traveling, he moved on. And the Baptists were excited to have new converts in this church that was dying. And so they sent some preachers there. But the Methodists didn't like this. And so they were afraid that these new converts Instead of becoming Methodist like the preacher, will be Baptist like the church. So they persuaded the preacher, Cartwright, to return to quote-unquote save his spiritual children from the very brink of the creek, which I think means believer's baptism, by a most desperate stratagem. Cartwright himself presented himself for Baptist membership. He recounted his own Christian experience and was received gleefully by the Baptist preacher. But at the last minute, in the hearing of everyone, he said, "No, I believe in infant sprinkling," and forced the Baptists to reject him publicly. And because of that rejection, the 23 converts went over to the Methodist church instead of the Baptist church. So it's like they're manipulating things, like fighting among themselves. It's pathetic. Next is that of inclusivism. You're changing your beliefs because of other beliefs. Now this one is a little bit debated, admittedly. So let's talk about the separate Baptists. You remember those guys? They were separate, trying to separate themselves. One of the first things to go in that separate movement was the doctrine of limited or definite atonement, meaning that the non-confessional Baptists had caved to those in their midst because they're like, well, we have people in our midst who aren't limited atonement, so let's not expect that of our church people. But what the non-confessional Calvinists didn't realize was that in accepting someone into their midst, or groups of people into their midst, who were not in favor of limited atonement, they were actually admitting that the so-called free will Baptists, I'm sure you've seen those churches, were just as biblical as they were. So they actually combined their efforts, the Calvinists and the non-Calvinists, to make a doctrinal statement called the New Hampshire Baptist Confession of Faith. It was composed around 1833, so almost 200 years ago, by John Newton Brown. It's actually still kind of a Calvinistic document, and it's a really good summary in some ways. The paragraph on the law and the gospel is quite good, in my opinion. But because of its motivations and its background, it actually was used to dilute the theology of Baptist churches. So, for instance, all the churches that I grew up in were in the GARBC, General Association of Regular Baptist Churches. The Regular Baptist movement was founded out of another movement which had its doctrinal statement of the New Hampshire Baptist Confession. So for 100 years, this doctrinal statement really formulated a lot of the churches in America, Baptists especially. So if you were to throw a dart at a map and it hits some city and you Google the churches in that city and they have a 1 or 2 page doctrinal statement, the odds are it looks or in some shape or form has been adopted or modified from the New Hampshire Baptist Confession of Faith. So that's why another reason why Reformed Baptists had diminished is because they had adopted a less robust confession. That confession, the New Hampshire one, eventually replaced the London and Philadelphia confessions here in the United States, which isn't necessarily a good thing, by the way. So if you want to read a great summary of the doctrines, you can use the Abstract of Principles from Southern Seminary, which is literally taken from the London Confession of Faith and put into a short statement. But in my view, to recover that doctrinal purity and the sound faith, we need to use a lengthy document like we have called the London Confession of Faith that will help our doctrine to remain clarified for the generations to come. All right, final lesson. The kids are still going in there, so we'll keep going. Is that of hyper-Calvinism. In the 1700s, Calvinism prospered so much to the extent that Arminianism was no longer the enemy. But now the enemy was hyper-Calvinism. So we looked at briefly last week John Gill, this British particular Baptist. He was solidly Trinitarian, but he leaned in a hyper-Calvinist direction. Hyper-Calvinism, by the way, is just the belief that the gospel call, that we shouldn't have a gospel call to those who are not elect. Well, where did this hyper-Calvinism mentality come from? It emerged from the British particular Baptists and the strict Baptist movement. So do you remember William Carey, who was wanting to go to the quote-unquote heathen. Why was he opposed? Exactly. And he said, well, I don't care. I believe in the free offer of the gospel. Let's take it to him anyway. I don't know who the elect are, so let's take it to him. So William Carey obviously believed in this kind of free gospel in opposition to the hyper-Calvinists. Andrew Fuller, another one that we mentioned last week in very brief words, opposed hyper-Calvinism. So where did this hyper-Calvinism movement spring up in America? Well, it grew up in the South. It sprung up in the South. It was a reaction against Arminianism and the methods of modern missions. So it was anti-evangelistic. It was passive. It even had a heretical element to it. For instance, this is a really weird one called the two seed and the spirit doctrine. The two seeds were planted in Eve, one by God, one by Satan, and the election of the individual is determined by which seed God planted in the person. And the missionaries and missions agencies can do nothing about it, and we should just leave it alone. It's kind of weird. Some of these you can still see today in the primitive Baptist movement. How many of you have ever heard of primitive Baptist? Okay. By the way, the Cincinnati Primitive Baptist Church is in the circles of these hyper-Calvinists, but they themselves do not believe in hyper-Calvinism. But that primitive Baptist, like if you see a primitive Baptist that's not this one, odds are pretty likely that it's going to be a hyper-Calvinist church, and probably psalm singing and instrumental only at that. So these reasons, these are 1800s reasons, by the way. Let me review them for you again since we've gone through them for a while. Depravity, independence, revivalism, Methodism, inclusivism, and hyper-Calvinism. Here's some lessons to learn. Slightly wrong doctrine can be just as damaging as heretical doctrine. J.I. Packer says something to this extent. A half-truth masquerading as a full truth can end up doing just as much damage. A half-truth masquerading as a whole truth can do just as much damage as a full falsified statement. Something to that effect. So we have to be careful in addressing even slightly wrong doctrine. There's also another danger, and it's that numbers can be deceiving. The 70,000 that supposedly were in America, they obviously were not very strong churches because within a short period of time, they had diminished and disappeared. Similarly, numbers can be deceiving with things like mega churches. Just because you have a mega church doesn't necessarily mean that you have mega theology. The bigger the church does not necessarily mean the better the theology. So, am I in favor of new confessions of faith? Sure, bring them on. But let's make sure they are helped and bolstered by the historic confessions which have survived the passing of time. Questions? Wes? Okay, Alex? Okay, Wes?
Someone brought up John Fox's Book of Martyrs, and it's the first time I noticed that the subtitle is Primitive Protestant Martyrs.
Okay.
And I was wondering, Primitive Baptist, Primitive Protestant.
I don't think there's a relation, but I could be wrong. Primitive can be used as just an adjective, as in like from yesteryear. Yeah, early. Primitive Baptist refers to a specific kind of Baptist, kind of like Reformed Baptist indicates something. I don't think there's a relation, but there could be. Alex?
There is another ism you can add to your
Okay.
reasons. Revivalism breeds nominalism.
Okay.
So you force brave sinners to make a decision that is only external and not, there's no real conversion of
Yeah.
which then causes churches filled with really unbelievers.
Yep.
Which means they're weak church, they're not no churches at all.
Yep.
They're weak churches.
And they didn't realize they were doing it, but they basically closed down their own churches. So it's important that we present the gospel to people, opposite of hyper-Calvinists. But yeah, when you present the gospel, make sure they actually are converted and you're not just trying to manipulate people into making a decision. That's a danger I'm sure you've seen in your own life. A person makes a decision at a young age, and then they abandon that decision later. Well, that's because it was a decision, not a conversion. All right. Let's pray and you'll be dismissed. Thank you, Father, for your church. Help us to not dilute or dismiss any doctrine or practice in our church, but to remain steadfast in word and in truth and grace and in mercy. In Christ's name, amen. Bastion.